Hello, good afternoon, everyone. This is Derrick Olsen, the president of WorldOregon, and it's an honor to be joining with this great lineup of panelists and moderator today for a special virtual program on extremism in the age of quarantine. We're thrilled to have you all join us. Appreciate you taking the time. I know this is a new experience for some of you. Others are experts at Zoom. We will be doing our best to have an engaging program and also keeping with the security protocols to help it be a safe and respectful conversation. I'll be introducing shortly Judy Margles, who will be moderating the conversation, but a quick note to say that this is a partnership among several nonprofits who, as you can imagine, are facing challenging times given this quarantine, pandemic, and recession. And I would encourage you, to the extent that you're able to support Western State Center, the Oregon Jewish Museum, and Center for Holocaust Education, and WorldOregon through membership or donation to help support virtual programs like these and the other work that we are doing in a virtual setting. So thank you in advance. Encourage you to go to all three of our websites and sign up for our newsletters, find a way to help philanthropically. It makes a huge difference. Again, this program, once it is completed, will be posted to YouTube that you can share out. And without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Judy, the moderator and host for today's proceedings. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Derrick. Thanks to everyone who's joining us from their homes today. And I do send you a special hope that you are all staying healthy. I'm gonna take just a really brief moment to frame our conversation, and then I'll introduce our esteemed panelists. When we first started hearing about the trolls, I think that's a familiar word to everybody these days, these trolls who have been able to disrupt Zoom meetings to broadcast hatred and racial slurs, I was hearing outraged responses from a number of people who were indignant that this crisis of the pandemic yet offered another layer of awfulness, this continued ability of extremists to promote their hate-filled rhetoric. Some of us who study and monitor patterns of how dangerous and hate speech spread have not been so surprised. It's a crisis, and like any other crisis, it's providing both domestic and global opportunities for far-right extremists to flourish. We're seeing in this country, most recently in the anti-stay-at-home rallies. I don't know whether you saw, but last week, of course, in a rally in Columbus, Ohio, what was circulated was a photograph of a rat. The rat was emblazoned with the Jewish star, and the slogan above read, "The real plague." We're seeing it globally as well, especially in the authoritarian regimes such as in Hungary, where President Viktor Orban was given the power to rule by decree and punish anyone who challenged his government's preferred narratives and the handling of the virus. So these are some of the issues we're going to delve into today in a conversation with Eric Ward. Eric is the executive director of the Western State Center, if you want to give a wave, and Randy Blazak, vice chair of the steering committee in charge of implementing the new Oregon bias crime law and chair of the Coalition Against Hate Crimes. Right. We're going to take the next 30 minutes or so to hear from our experts. You're welcome to pose questions. You're going to see a button on your screen called Q&A, and you can put a question in the Q&A, and we'll be moderating those questions after the discussion. So I think my first question to both of you, and it's really just a way to help you introduce yourselves, talk a little bit about what is extremism in this age of quarantine and what it's meant to you in the way that your work has shifted in the last 2 months. And I'll ask Randy to start.
Yeah, that's a huge question. And thanks again for this opportunity. I mean, I think it's really important that we find new ways of communicating what's going on in the world and what we might be able to do about it. Yeah, this world has pioneered online platforms. They were on the internet before any of us knew what the internet was. They were using sort of bulletin boards in the 80s before any of us even got online. And so they've been very flexible in finding new opportunities to reach people. And so I think part of what we'll be able to talk about today is how they've sort of exploited the online platforms to both recruit and spread their ideology. So part of it has been just doing more of what at least people like I have been doing in the past, which is sort of playing whack-a-mole as they move around cyberspace and figuring out how they're exploiting the moment. But the other part of how this work has changed on the community side is, you know, normally we, especially through the Coalition Against Hate Crimes, we're meeting with folks in the community and having regular conversations and having meetings with law enforcement and just kind of getting a pulse of what's happening on the street level. And that's been challenged by this pandemic that we're in. And so there's a little extra step. It's not impossible, but a little extra step to be able to do that outreach to communities to find out how they're experiencing these issues. And so, you know, it takes a little more effort to say, oh, you know, I haven't talked to members of this particular community for a while. Instead of just sort of bumping into them at one of our community meetings, you have to actually sort of make the effort to say, hey, what have you heard in your community? So we're adapting just like they are. I think we're probably a couple steps behind those folks in the extremist world, but we're finding ways to do that.
Derrick?
Thank you, Judy. Judy, it's great to see you, and thanks to you and WorldOregon for inviting Western State Center to join you today. You know, I think of an incident, I've talked about this a lot in public speaking in my writing, but I think it speaks to today. And, you know, I won't tell it in my long kind of Baptist way. I'll try to be quick, right? But a few years ago, there was an alt-right demonstration in Portland, and there was a young alt-right activist who was also probably a white nationalist who was getting kind of cornered by this guy with a video camera who was just screaming at this alt-right guy saying, like, why are you in our town, right? No one wants you here. And the white nationalist responded by saying, yeah, I've heard that too, that we're not welcomed here. But he went on to say, the fact of the matter is Portland is a urban city in America, one of the few with a shrinking Black population by both whole number and whole percentage. He then said after that, so you can say you don't want us here, but the truth of the matter is that Portland is getting away with something we could never do, right? Which is disappearing the Black community of Portland, Oregon. I shared that story because we are really in a moment both where we have to understand the tactics of anti-authoritarian social movements like white nationalists. But the truth of the matter is we also have to spend time understanding why our institutions often help facilitate the work of white nationalists. The truth is whether we're talking about the internet, whether we're talking about influence on policy, whether we are talking about criminal acts, you know, if white nationalists are able to be successful at this, it is not because they are more creative than the rest of us. It is because our institutions are failing in their response to these phenomena. So in terms of online, we are seeing an incredible increase of online organizing and rhetoric. There is a lot of fear in the wake of COVID. People are looking for information. They are not getting that information in a satisfactory manner from government leadership. 30 years of attacks on local and federal government have made people wary of government. We hear the frame anti-government. And so white nationalists have stepped into that void with terrible information that has created acts of violence, but has created more fear and paranoia and ignorance among the general population. But let's be clear, no matter how sophisticated they are, right, they couldn't do that if Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and others were not so tied to their profit margins, right? We have a white nationalist problem. But we also have a problem with tech industry, right? That is more committed to its profit margin than its collective responsibility to America. The fact of the matter is this, that they would not be these strong companies, right? If they had to do it without reliance on American tax dollars for roads, subsidies around technology, our universities. And they have abandoned us in the American public in time of need. So while the white nationalist movement may have a lot of blood on its hand, the fact of the matter is our tech industry has as much blood on their hands because they have facilitated the easy propagation of this rhetoric.
So maybe we can just dig down a little bit more. You know, Eric, you're saying our institutions have failed us. You mentioned leadership. Maybe we could just talk a little bit more about leadership and maybe elected leadership. Some of our elected officials they're using the virus as a political position rather than a public health crisis. But we're also seeing others who are actually showing rational, empathetic leadership. So what does leadership look like right now? What should it look like? What is its failures? What are its promises? Eric, maybe I'll ask you to start and then Randy.
Yeah. So I think we should talk about leadership and governance at this time. You know, to go back, you know, we should spend as much time talking about what we should be doing as much as we should be talking about what the white nationalist movement and other hate groups are doing. And so I really appreciate this question. We are in a time right now where within a few days, the equivalent of the entire population of Medford, Oregon will have died from the COVID pandemic. And I'll let folks hold that for a while. Just this morning, to give another, you know, clear understanding, you know, the Olsen Stadium in Eugene, Oregon, the home of the Ducks, holds approximately 40,000 people when it is sold out. The equivalent of that has died from COVID in the last 2 months here in the United States alone. Some of those deaths may be unavoidable, but many of those deaths have come about because government, particularly the White House, failed to respond for over 70 days to this real challenge. That created a lot of fear and paranoia. And in that fear and paranoia, the American public started to look for answers from elsewhere. We are very lucky in terms of our federalism, our system of federalism in this country, because the saving grace and the safety net turned out to be state governors and mayors of municipal cities who have stepped up in really strong and vibrant ways. And we have seen the impact of that with the limited deaths in Oregon, the lower amount that has taken place in California, and the flattening that is now beginning to occur in the state of New York. What we know is that this was responded to in two ways. There was the correct way, which was understanding that we are in a public health crisis. This is not a political moment, right? This is a global pandemic. And this global pandemic has disrupted our lives and has disrupted our norms. There are others who sought to take advantage of that public health crisis through dividing Americans at a time we needed to come together. And that included some elected officials. But not only that, there are post challenges that will come into play. Unemployed, over 25 million Americans are now unemployed in the United States. It is likely that very soon, within a year, 1 out of every 5 Americans will be unemployed in the United States. And that means, as communities, we have to find points of unity, points where we come together, where we shape and keep our communities safe. But what we are seeing are elected officials who are tapping into people's fear, not to bring folks together, but to drive them apart at a time where we have to be unified as Oregonians. And so I think if I could urge people to do anything right now, it is continue to understand the real threat of white nationalists and the alt-right movements in our state and how they seek to divide us. The other, though, is to really let your local officials know how you feel in this moment. And when they are doing things that are right, when they are doing things that strengthen the community, that preserve the economies within our states, that provide for the most vulnerable, that ensure, right, that life does continue on when we come out of this health pandemic. They need to hear from you as well. It is a time for us not to be silent. We are at home, right? Pick up your phone, send an email, send a text, write something on social media. Let your mayor and governor know that you support them right now. The majority of Americans, right? Over 80% of Americans believe that it is critically important not to return to work until it is safe for folks to do so, until there is a chance that our economy can stabilize rather than have to retract again within 2 months. We have to speak out, right? White nationalists and other folks who attack democratic practice aren't going to win because they are the majority. They will win because the rest of us are silent.
Thanks. Randy?
Yeah, I would like to, thanks Eric for that. I mean, it's really important that people not be lulled into kind of a sense of safety from their homes when this issue is really sort of intensifying out in our communities. And I wanted to circle back to your question, Judy, and relate it to these folks that Eric and I spend so much of our time keeping an eye on, which is the extreme right. And there have been varying levels of darkness that have happened because of this epidemic and this pandemic. I mean, the first thing that we saw was a fairly dramatic spike in hate crimes and harassing behavior against Asian and Asian Americans. That was sort of right out of the box. We saw that happen, that sort of victim blaming and scapegoating and people calling it the coronavirus and the Wuhan flu and all that. And that came, from the top on down. But then when we really look at the kind of, I'm going to go super dark here, sort of the more extreme elements, I have to remind people that on the 19th of this month, we marked the 25th anniversary of the Oklahoma City bombing. Timothy McVeigh's goal in that bombing that killed 168 people, including 19 children in a daycare facility, was to start a race war in America. He was tapped into a movement that believed the federal government was controlled by a global Jewish cabal, and the only way to purge the government was to start a second American Revolution, a second Civil War, and drive all these non-American people, in quotes, out of the country through brutal violence. The ideology behind the McVeigh bombing has not gone away, and it has sought to exploit any type of moment when the government might collapse. So for example, some folks might remember Y2K. As we sort of got towards the year 2000, there was a belief that the computers would crash and this would be their moment to attack. Well, as a person who's been doing this work for over 30 years now, I have never seen that movement more mobilized than it is now. It sees this pandemic and the economic contraction that's happening along with it as their chance to move. They call it now the Boogaloo. There is a group called the Accelerationists that want society to collapse as quickly as possible, and that they will be able to launch their anti-Semitic wave of racist and xenophobic violence when all this sort of collapses. And so as we're watching the economic issues and the people who can't work and the people who are protesting the shutdowns, this thing is happening underneath online, but now increasingly popping up at these rallies of these folks that are just arming themselves and are waiting for this next collapse to happen so they can launch their second American Revolution. So as we focus on the kind of immediate issues of people being harassed or people being blamed or people being beaten up because they're seen as somehow the root of the violence, there's also this anti-government movement bubbling behind it. And so this is the catch-22 of leadership, because there's a lot of these folks who have looked at the lockdown orders as an example of the overreach of the federal government suppressing our civil liberties. And this is the core of their debate from way back when, is that the federal government, this global Jewish socialist cabal that wants to take away the rights of white people, wants to trump individual civil liberties and take away Second Amendment rights and First Amendment rights. And in the sense, they've got this narrative, right? Because your right to assemble has now taken a back seat to public health. So they've got kind of an audience that will listen to what they have to say about the Constitution, you know, and what's happening to people's rights to assemble in public as an example of this thing that's happening to them. And so they've rallied and started to really amp up the narrative about this is happening. This is Y2K times 1,000. This is going to be the big movement. And so as we look at these protests that are happening, and as people are sort of not getting the good information like Eric talked about, and kind of going on the internet and getting these conspiracy theories that very quickly go back to sort of an anti-Semitic trope, there is this larger thing happening. So the leadership has to be able to, whether it's on the state level or the national level, has to be able to speak to people's fears and their notion that your civil liberties still matter and your First Amendment rights and all the other rights still matter, but we got to get through this. And we haven't had effective expression on a national level talking to people's fears about losing their constitutional rights, which has just pushed more and more people into this nationalist Second American Revolution panic, and it really is a real threat that we have to keep an eye on. And so I just wanted to kind of link those two things about where the leadership can help us, but what is actually happening while we are sitting here watching all this unfold.
We can identify how the leadership could help us. Can you imagine a scenario where the leadership will help us? I mean, is there anything we can be doing to sort of push our leadership to actually do what you're suggesting they have to do?
Yeah, I mean, that is such an important question. And I think part of it, and again, this is the challenge, but part of it is cutting through the noise. There is so much misinformation. There are people that are spraying bleach into their mouth. I mean, there's just so much bad information out there that is really hurting people. And so there has to be a calm, rational, connected to science, connected to the facts voice. And so, you know, as much as we can encourage that and sort of lift those voices up, whether it's on the state level or in the federal level, I mean, we're in this for a while. Everybody wants to put an end date when we get back to normal, but we're in this for a while. So it's going to take a concerted effort to really lift those voices and encourage those voices to be paid attention to.
Yeah. Eric, did you want to add anything, or?
No, I agree with Randy. Look,
yeah.
I think that we are in a time where within the first 2 months of the pandemic, we have seen 3 attempts at mass murders driven by COVID. All 3 of those were attempting to target Jewish institutions, or were driven by anti-Semitism, whether we're talking about the individual who was arrested in Missouri for targeting a hospital and medical workers and patients because he believed that COVID was a Jewish conspiracy, whether we're talking about the individual who left an explosive out of the Jewish elder home in Massachusetts, also who thought he was fighting against COVID by attacking the Jewish community, or the other individual who was recently arrested in Massachusetts for plotting an attack on either a Muslim or Jewish house of worship. I'm not sure how much evidence we need that the level of violence and intimidation that has raged across the country over the last 4 years is simply not going away. It is very real. We are seeing the impact on online media. Recent studies now show nearly a quarter of Americans believe that COVID is not a health pandemic, but a conspiracy in some ways, which flies in the face of science, right? It is the equivalent of getting on a plane and having 9 pilots tell you that the plane is not safe to fly, right? and you still decide based off of no skills or understanding whatsoever that the plane is perfectly fine. It is that level going on, and enough so that people now think that drinking disinfectant and bleach is wise. So it's not to make fun of people. It's to point out the level of fear, right, and the lack of education. And so we really need city governments to really step up. We need state governments to step up. There is frankly not one governmental body at the state and local level that should not be meeting at this point, right? We are a nation in crisis, and a nation in crisis means our own state, while I'm not feeling the brunt of that crisis yet, will. And it's time for us to get into motion and to understand that there are movements out there who see this as an opportunity, right, to attack and dismantle democratic practice. And they may use the rhetoric of democracy, but at the end of the day, what they are doing is undercutting democracy through intimidation and fear.
Good. No, thank you. And of course, we've been talking a lot about the Pacific Northwest. We've been talking about the United States, but this is a global pandemic, and maybe we'll just travel across the pond. We're seeing that, you know, if you want to call this populism, it's being normalized around the country and around the globe. Eric, when we were talking earlier, you had mentioned, you had focused on 4 countries, if I remember correctly: Hungary, Turkey, Brazil, and India, where you see sort of similar kinds of extremism. And I'd love you both to comment on some of the parallels between what is happening here and what's happening abroad. And maybe Randy, I'll have you go first.
Okay, yeah, I mean, there are parallels, whether we're talking about Brexit or, you know, the Indian nationalism that's happening. There is a global movement against globalization. We are a much more global economy now. I mean, there is evidence of that in the clothes that we wear that are from, you know, all over the world, and the way that our money travels globally, the way that we pay attention to the Nikkei index as much as the Dow Jones. I mean, we live in a global economy, and there has been pushback against that, and that has been the rise of nationalism in countries that feel, the Brexit example is sort of the best example outside of the US, where people feel their national identity is disappearing. And that often gets woven up in the fear of the outsider, the fear of the immigrant, this kind of xenophobia. And so we're seeing a new appeal, you know, from Russia to Brazil, of these sort of nationalist movements that are tied into some type of racial identity. And of course, globalism has an old, you know, connotation that goes way back, really to the French Revolution, about being a sort of global Jewish conspiracy. The Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion, that bogus document about how the Jews sort of are working to control the world. All of a sudden, that mentality gets tied into the nationalist movement. So it's sort of like, you know, a little scratch. If you scratch it a little bit farther, you know, it's not about nationalism, it's about anti-globalism. And you go a little bit farther and it becomes an anti-Semitic theory about globalization. And so we're seeing these old foes, these, you know, neo-Nazis and fascists and movements that have been around for a while, using this moment in the world's history, this sort of nationalist moment, to sort of bring back these old tropes about the global Jewish conspiracy, and finding new recruits where they never, you know, where they would have been written off before as that's an old dead ideology. All of a sudden they have a new breath of life in them. And it's quite frightening, especially for the people who are the targets of those, including immigrant populations and Muslim populations and minority populations in these countries that are now seen as the cause of the problem. And so this is a global epidemic. There's a sort of a Trump phenomenon, if I can use that, in multiple countries around the world that want to make their country great again, which is make their country ethnically and racially pure again.
Yeah, thank you, Eric.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think we can, whether we're talking about the targeting of Muslim citizenry in India, and how they are being exploited, how they are being terrorized, through Islamophobia that occurred before the pandemic and how that is now playing out under the pandemic, I think is for real concern, right? There are real, for all the rhetoric here in this country from folks who are marching around with guns in front of the state capitol, but yet can say without irony that their rights are being stripped from them, right? There are folks who are actually facing real human rights and civil liberties crises. And it's not just in the United States, it's global, right? At the end of March, right? 2 weeks into the coronavirus and the pandemic, you know, Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban effectively became the world's newest dictator when the country's parliament voted to suspend elections and grant him power to rule by decree with no time limit, right? Elections have been suspended in what was a democratic country. And the person who is the dictator of that country is now accountable to no one. And that was done under the guise of meeting the pandemic that was happening. I think that is the first of many developments that will be happening around the world. And we have to be worried, right? We have to understand that part of dealing with this health crisis is ensuring that our democratic practices maintain. And we are at a time where that is being tested. It's being tested in ways that aren't always clear. And so it's important to say, right? Should people have the right to protest? Absolutely, right? It is a fundamental right in our country. You know, do people have the right to manipulate, right, that protest as if somehow they are suffering some huge calamity, right, that ignores the real calamities that are happening in our society? Absolutely not. So it's all in short to say there are real civil liberties crises that are happening in our world and in our country. So in Maine, right, we had an incident where 4 people, right, in a home that they owned, right, and were staying in, right, had an armed mob cut trees across their property, cut their electric, right, where police had to come in force to disperse a mob. That is a civil liberties violation. Forcing people, right, to a choice between exposing themselves to COVID, right, and voting, as was done in Wisconsin, is a real civil liberties. Having to stay in one's house or wear a mask, right, or wash one's hand is an inconvenience. It's not a civil liberties violation. And for those, I think we have to sometimes call people on this, right? We have people on one hand saying they won't wash their hands because it's slavery, but they're willing to drink bleach, right? And that is utterly ridiculous and immature and irresponsible. That's not a political position, right? That is about tearing communities apart and causing confusion.
Yep. We're getting a lot of questions in the chat, so I want to wind up, but I want to just try and double up on one question and give you a chance both to comment on 2 different things. So one, if you want to give us some tips for reliable sources of information, websites you think we should go to, of course, Western State Center is supreme. Everybody should definitely be checking that one out, but what else? But, you know, how can we not, you both talked a lot about fear, and how can we not be cowed by fear? We can't go out, as you say. Extremism is in our midst. So what are people who are listening today, how can they become more aware? How can they know how they might respond to the problem?
Yeah.
Derrick, why don't
Okay.
you start?
Yeah,
Oh,
that's a big one.
I
It's a
looked
big
at
one.
Randy
Sorry,
right now.
it is. I
Well,
put like three
I mean,
questions together.
the good news is there is some good news. I mean, the good news is there is a civil. I'm going to speak as a sociologist for a moment. There are ways that we are adapting, that we are finding community like this, like finding new ways to help our neighbors and to be more plugged in. I mean, it's a good opportunity to have some reflection. We don't do that very much in our culture, to think about what can I do. So my students this quarter, for example, are reading a great book called White Fragility. So we can think about how we think about race and how we talk about race. So there is an opportunity to use this time on ourselves. I often say, there's sort of three levels that we work on these issues: the institutional level, the cultural level, and the personal level. So we have an opportunity to become more aware, to read, and to have conversations with other people and participate in conversations like this. So there's a great opportunity to work on ourselves. But then there's also an opportunity, since, I always think that we're always saying, I don't have enough time to do that. I don't have time to do that. I wish I had time to do that. You've got some time. You've got some time to learn about some of the resources that are in the community that will help. And so one of the things I wanted to talk about is in Oregon, we have a new bias crime law. We have a new bias crime law that is quite unique, that provides resources for people who have been impacted by bias crimes and bias incidents, even things that don't rise to the level of crime, including people sort of verbally harassing you. We're going to be tracking the data, and we're going to be connecting people who have experienced this with community groups if need be. So one of the things, I'm going to put in the chat, I'm going to put a link. Let's see if I can pull this off. I'm going to put a link. Oh, that's the Q&A. In the chat, I'm going to put a link to some information about our new state law. And so I encourage people to take a look at it and the resources that are there. And this is sort of a twofold plea to people. One is, if you have experienced bias, whether it's criminal or not, please get in touch with us through the hotline that's there on that website, and let people know so that we can find resources to help you. But also, if you're a community group that's interested in helping people through the process, because we know these experiences are highly traumatizing. You are attacked because of your religion or the color of your skin or your sexual orientation. And it's not just something, like having your laptop stolen. It can be something that sticks with you for a while. So we want there to be trauma-informed care resources available. So if you're a community group that's interested in helping out in this effort, this is a great time to connect with the state and become a part of our state network. And so whether you're a therapist or a member of an LGBTQ group in Eastern Oregon, we would love to have you connect with us through this website that I just posted. So hopefully it's there and people can all link onto it. Good. So the quick answer is, this is a time to work on ourselves, to be more resilient, to be more knowledgeable, to be more empathetic, but also this is a time to reach out and build some of those bridges to community groups and find out what resources are there and how you can help out. Good,
thanks. Derrick, you get the last word.
I'm going to get the last word, and I'll be quick. So I think there's three things folks can do, right? So first is, it's okay to be afraid. This is frightening. There's a lot going on in the world, and it can feel overwhelming. And you're going to have good days and you're going to have bad days as we go through this. And I think it's okay to admit that and understand it, right? There's no harm in understanding that this is a really heavy time that we are going through in our state, in our country, and around the world, and everyone is experiencing it. We just happen to be experiencing it differently depending on what day we are in, right? The second is that I encourage folks to be in touch, to be in an organization like Randy's Oregon Coalition Against Hate Crime, or Portland United Against Hate, or the Rural Organizing Project, or Community Alliance of Lane County. There are organizations across the state, and I encourage people to find one that resonates with you and be part of that group and that conversation. The third is this, and I think this takes the most courage, right? Which is to smile at your neighbor, right? And begin the process of reaching out with your neighbors. I want to be clear. This is not about being Republican or Democrat. This is not about liberal or conservative, right? This is about building inclusion versus exclusion, because inclusion keeps us safe. Inclusion keeps us healthy, and inclusion sets our dreams for the future. So I don't care if you are a 72-year-old Republican veteran, right, living in rural Oregon, or a 17-year-old Latina trans woman, you know, on the streets of Portland. You both are trying to better your lives right now, and Oregon owes you, right, the dignity of giving you opportunity, right, and helping you survive a global pandemic. And so what I encourage folks to do is to get to know your neighbor, right? If you're a conservative, right, and you've been a prepper all your life, well, what a great time not to mock your neighbors, but to help them at least plant an herbal garden, right? If you don't like your conservative neighbor next door, right, what a time to knock on their door, to send them a note and see if they need something from the store the next time you go. We're not asking people to adopt each other's politics. We're asking people to center the value, the key value of Oregon, which is we have always taken care of each other in moments like this, and this time should be no different.
Thank you. I'm going to turn the program. Tim, are you there?
I sure am.
Okay, Tim DeRoche is the Director of Programs for WorldOregon. He's going to monitor the Q&A. Also want to give Tim a shout out for putting this panel together today. So thank you, Tim. And
Thanks, Tim.
go ahead and ask the questions.
Well, and thank all three of you. This is excellent, and I've got some wonderful questions here. I'm going to open up with a question from Bob Hornstein. Hey, Bob, thanks for the question. Should there be a change in November, do you believe that these groups will eventually go back into the shadows, or are they now out of the margins permanently, with their messages slowly seeping into the mainstream as we know it?
Let me just quickly say, yeah. I mean, if there is a change in November, there's a large contingent that has already said they won't accept it. And they will see the hand, the invisible hand of the conspiracy at work if their man isn't elected. And so before the COVID issue became the dominant issue, my main concern is what happens in November if there is someone else elected, and what will happen then. So I think they were already preparing for that reality, which is, again, and one of the things I wanted to say, in terms of what we can do about this, one of the things that happened after the Oklahoma City bombing is law enforcement, both federal and local, realized that they needed to partner with community groups in a much more sort of outreach style to figure out what is happening on the ground. And so there is a lot of communication that's happening between community groups and law enforcement, especially the FBI, around these issues. They broke up so many plots leading up to Y2K that a lot of people didn't even know about. So I think keeping those channels of communication are going to be really important. It's challenging, of course, particularly with this administration, but I know good people in law enforcement who are really watching this very closely, and they were really sort of on guard about what might happen in November. And so this is just a step in that direction. So I don't think this is going away anytime soon.
I think I agree with Randy. It won't go away. I think that is irregardless of the outcome of the federal elections. This is a phenomena that is here to stay. And I think it's less a conversation of about them, whether they will go back in the shadows, and a conversation about when do the rest of us, the people of goodwill, right, begin to come out of the shadows, right? And to understand that it is a democracy, but it needs someone to stand up and fight for that democracy. And we have to stand up. And that means being really courageous. So for instance, we just had 2 weeks of people turning out in the streets with their weapons and helping to spread the coronavirus actually further. Some of those folks have fallen victim. It means Medical folks have also likely fallen victim, that their parents and their children and those that they know, some of them will eventually fall victim from contracting coronas. It was irresponsible, right? And I want us to take a moment and think about just a month before that, how the media and the rest of us lambasted college students who flocked to the beaches in a much similar pattern. And I want us to think about our response to these folks showing up with weapons and anti-Semitic messages, doing basically the same thing under a political guise, right? And the lack of response, right, from elected officials and from the rest of us that even matched anywhere near the level that these college students received. That is the disparity that I'm talking about, right? And it is not the white nationalist movement that will sink democracy in this country. It is our unwillingness to confront that disparity, right? It's time for us to fight for democracy. It needs us.
So I'm reminded of this wonderful poster from the WPA period that said, I believe democracy requires work, that it is not a given. And I've always loved that it is a messy form of improvisation that requires both a level of unity and a lot of leadership, but it is dependent on looking at the sort of multiple voices. The other side of that question comes from Tom DeMeo. Tom, great to see your name again. Tom has been very active with the Columbia River Peace Corps group. Is there also a risk that this administration might continue to curtail rights when the pandemic is either over or has been contained?
There is definitely, I mean, looking at other countries, right? There is certainly the risk of civil liberties and rights being curtailed. It is why local and state government becomes so important in this moment for places like Oregon. But our elected officials don't know what we're thinking unless we're communicating with them, right? They are hearing from a very small majority in the state, and what they are hearing is threats of violence. What they are hearing is this idea that government isn't essential or important. And we just have to look around over the last 2 months to understand how critical government by the people, right, is in these moments. And so my quick take is, yes, we have to be extremely cautious. Not just folks on the left, not just folks on the right, all of us need to be concerned about real legitimate attempts to usurp civil liberties and rights that have been built over decades in this country.
And I would just quickly add to that the one player that really hasn't come into the forefront yet on this issue have been the courts, and the courts looking at the constitutionality of some of these measures and when they do overstep their boundaries. I mean, everybody has been sort of trying to stay safe, but I think in the coming months, we will see courts all the way up to the federal courts really look at, are these measures overstepping their boundaries? And that debate is going to happen.
That's right.
So that kind of leads into, pardon me, this next question. Before I get to the question, want to highlight something that WorldOregon is doing on Thursday. Information is not up, it'll be up later today, but it really gets into some of both the legal and the sort of, civic ecology issues around this. Champon Sinla Pasai, who is an attorney with Mirandis Sinla Pasai Garcia LLC, one of our premier immigration law firms, is going to be doing a program at the same time on COVID-19's impact on immigrant and refugee communities. So if you want to sort of peel the onion skin back on some of these issues, that will be a great way to look at how it's affecting both local, regional, national, and our global families in this issue. And then the question is, this is from Samuel Goldberg, previous health and social crises have seen property grabs against vulnerable minority populations. Los Angeles in 1924, Japanese internment, Katrina. Is there a fear of that happening during this crisis, particularly given the disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on Black and Brown communities?
Well, you know, we've seen this epidemic impact a lot of different populations in a more kind of intensified way, including lower income people, the houseless population. And so there is, you know, certainly there's a concern in the community. And I think that the people who do this work, like the Fair Housing Council of Oregon, could really speak to this, that when the dust clears, there will be kind of a new landscape of who owns what in terms of residential facilities. And so, I mean, I think this is, again, where the advocacy and activism that Derrick speaks to about people coming out and making sure that people are protected is really important, because there are extremely vulnerable populations that are now much more vulnerable because of the situation that we're in, including people who are on the, you know, one rent check that they're now not going to get from being out on the street.
So there's a question here directed at Randy, but I think I'm going to direct it to both Eric and Randy. Pat asks, could you please explain and define globalism a little bit more in depth?
Well, that's a big question. I mean, we talk about globalism as being both economic. There's a sort of a lack of national borders now in terms of our economy. You know, lots of people offshore their money. I mean, Swiss bank accounts being the old way of doing that. But the idea that we are in a global marketplace and that, you know, you go to your favorite store and everything has a made in somewhere else sticker on it, that's part of that. I mean, my favorite statistic is 10% of everything that's leaving the country of China is heading to a Walmart somewhere in the world. Right, that is a reflection of the global economy that we have. But we also have a globalization in terms of our culture and the ideas of, you know, Hollywood used to be the old way that we globalized, but the sort of notion of a kind of global culture that we're all sharing in common ideology impinges on a little bit of the national identity that countries have, which includes this sort of refrain of open borders, that we're now a global economy. And so we have people from all over the world coming into our nation, and that changes the culture of our nation. And so it's a mix of both the economic and the cultural that causes some people to fear, and this is just the natural evolution of the planet, but some people to fear that thing that makes a nation unique. And so part of the pushback against globalization is preserving national identity in the face of this new kind of one world perspective that has emerged over the last 100 years.
Yeah, I also think, look, the question of globalism, which is often maligned, but I think, you know, any kind of healthy globalism, right, rests on the idea first of some kind of I don't want to call it like a chauvinism, right, but a form of nationalism that I think is grounded in patriotism. And what I mean by that is, you know, patriotism is really just a preference for the things you know, not because they're better, right, but because they're just the things you're familiar with. And those things evolve over time quite naturally. And it's important to understand, though, that evolution and change produces anxiety, right? The way that we adapt to anxiety, right, is not by isolating ourselves, but by leaning in, right? And we tend to find the benefits of those things. It's why America now excels in French fries, right? Why we have some of the best baseball teams in the entire world, right? Some of those things are based off of the natural evolution, right? Of being interconnected in larger and more significant ways. It doesn't mean people have to give up the things that they prefer, right? But neither do you get to deny rights to other folks. I think that we are coming into a moment of a backlash against the idea of being interconnected, the idea of inclusion. But at the end of the day, right, what we are talking about when we talk about that global interconnectedness is that we can have societies where everyone is in and no one is out, right? And everyone's children, right, have the chance for a better opportunity than we've had. That is not different from the core of American values, of the idea that I grew up in, the idea that the world for our children can be better than the world was for us. And that is nothing to be ashamed of, right? And that is an interconnected value. While it may be an American idea, right, it's also a world idea. And we just need to focus, right, and center those values that interconnect us. And that's hard to do when you have other folks driving division.
Mm-hmm.
So that brings up a really interesting sort of tension, I think, that we see, which is the tension between what we know and what we believe. And this idea of what our friends at the Rand Corp call truth decay.
That's right.
So Sandy Polishuk wants to know maybe some strategies in addition to writing for people who are on the side of, reason and fact. How do we pay better attention and reinforce science and fact-based knowledge when in fact people presented with the facts will still continue to believe and know in very, very different push-me-pull-you ways?
Yeah. So I would encourage three things. So the first is, we have to lead that, we have to distinguish between fact and what is a predominant kind of gathering of evidence, right? That leads us towards a certain conclusion. And what I mean by that is I may not know as a fact, though I can guess, that bleach kills people, right? But I have read enough stories of folks who have poisoned themselves, right, and ended up in the hospital to conclude that drinking bleach is probably not a good idea, right? And so I think it's look, we have to be clear about what facts are. We have to be clear about what the preponderance of evidence is, right, in decision-making and in choices. The second thing we have to do, though, is I think we have to stop debating things that are not grounded in fact. Look, I am not going to spend my day debating with someone whether the sky is purple or blue, right? That is a waste of time, but too often, right, we provide platforms for those very type of debates, right? I'm not saying that folks can't believe the sky is purple. What I'm saying is it's not my job to build a platform for them, right? They can build their own platform for that. And so we have to get to a place, right, where there is debate over opinion, right? But we have to stop debating some of the most basic facts, right, of life. The third thing that I think we have to do, right, is we need a stronger literacy around media in this country. It is getting tougher for folks to understand the difference between fake news, right, and researched journalism. A lot of that has to do with the fact that journalism is no longer independent. A lot of it is driven by ad revenue, right, and by profit margin. That makes it at points unbiased at times. And so we really have to strengthen up our information categories in the society. Journalism schools need more funding, right? Young journalists need much more support in learning the trades of journalism. But we need an American population that is literate when it comes to information, particularly news information today.
Can I just quickly add my 2 cents into that? And that's so much of what we need to do, so important. But I would also add, we are all children of the Enlightenment, and we need to remember those Enlightenment principles that brought this country together from the beginning, and that's the idea of rationality and empiricism, that we need to think about things rationally that make sense. And I think Eric's right, we need to sort of dispense with the things that are nonsensical, and we need to look at real empirical evidence, real research. I mean, we need to be little Galileos in our daily lives and think, does this make sense? And is there evidence of that? And the other part of that, plug for Galileo, the other part of that is when we encounter people who don't share those values, we got to develop a sense of civility. It's very easy to, I don't know how many times I've typed idiot or moron over, you know, the last 3 years, because I get so angry about people's positions, but I don't win anybody over to my side by pushing them away and putting them down. We have to find a way of reaching out to those people and helping them understand rationality and empiricism and bring them into the world of fact and knowledge. And I think that might be sort of a way out of this dark period. If we can just sort of lead those people, like we've led people out of the world of hate, right? There are a lot of former neo-Nazis that are now doing really good work against racism, that we use that empathy on top of those scientific values of rationality and empiricism to get us back on track. Because right now, the way it looks like the Enlightenment is over and we're back into the fantasy land of the Dark Ages. And we want to kind of drive ourselves out of that.
Well, I can't think of a better way to Tinker's Everest to chance this back into Judy's lap. But Judy, it is all yours. Great answers to some really good questions. Thank you all for submitting them. Judy,
Sure. I'm here.
work it.
Yeah, what a privilege to be with Eric and Randy today. And I'm giving you a virtual handshake. Well deserved. Thank you so much. What I really appreciated that you actually gave us hope too. And I think hope is really important. I want to harken back to what Derrick said at the beginning of the program. There are a lot of nonprofits out there that need your support. If you have support to give, choose one, give what you can, and know that your donation is so gratefully appreciated at this critical time. I'll end here. Thanks so much for joining us, and a huge hand to Eric Ward and Randy Blazak.
Thank you so much.
WorldOregon, wonderful to be partnering with you. Thank you. Bye.
Bye now.
Bye.